Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. I am here as the motion picture analyst to do the next in my series of commentaries for the James Bond films, the official original Eon series. Of course, today we'll be talking about 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, the seventh film in the series, which marked the return of Sean Connery to the role after a one-film absence, and in many ways became a film to sidestep around the perceived failure of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which for many years was viewed as a financial failure, which it actually was not, and it was necessary for the series to be rediscovered by its audience because, of course, many people presumed that Bond was dead and buried as a franchise, particularly going into the new decade of the 1970s. So I think it was very wise, particularly on the part of United Artists, to realize that significant changes needed to be made, and there needed to be a conscious effort and desire to, firmly reestablish Bond for film audiences of 1971. So ultimately, the original plan of doing a On Her Majesty's Secret Service sequel in the form of Diamonds Are Forever with Peter Hunt and George Lazenby returning, unfortunately, just kind of fell apart, particularly and especially once George Lazenby actually walked out on his contract, because contrary to what most people believe, he was, offered the contract, and it was his backing out of said deal that led everyone involved to just say, no, we're done. So anyway, there is actually quite an interesting pre-production process. The casting process itself is very interesting to look at. Look at who was bandied about in the casting sessions, who United Artists suggested even going with American stars, particularly since the film primarily takes place in America, just as Fleming's novel does. And also the challenges of adapting said novel, which most people feel is one of Fleming's weaker efforts, simply because it is a very straight-ahead, straightforward storyline, and all takes place primarily in America without the standard flashiness that we're used to and accustomed to for a Bond film. So I do think this is a very underrated film, and I think that it forms loosely into what I like to call a trilogy of sorts. There is a Blofeld trilogy in Fleming's work, linking the novels of Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and You Only Live Twice, being the three major appearances of Blofeld and Spectre in the novels. Well, I think the films actually have a trilogy, and I think stylistically it should be referred to as the Mankiewicz trilogy. Of course, referring to the, let's face it, the absolutely brilliant screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz, who was never given the proper credit deserved for just the sparks of energy he interjected into the series, which I think is the key component that is the fresh blood in the production crew of Diamonds Are Forever that gives it a new freshness. And while he was an absolute genius at just beyond witty comedy and comedic setups, I think he also had developed a flair for doing Bond, and so his three credited Bond productions, I think, can be looked at as their own particular corner of the Bond film franchise. And of course, they go in successive order, and all three were directed by Guy Hamilton. So even though Mankiewicz did have significant involvement on The Spy Who Loved Me, which went uncredited, and he did do some of the development work on Moonraker, so his fingers are there a little bit afterwards in the Roger Moore era, I do think that the three films he's credited with, and actually, has the credited, screenplay work, I think they have such a consistency in tone and such a unity among them, even though they sort of have different elements between them. I think it's interesting to look at them as sort of a stylistic trilogy of sorts, if you want to call it that. So that's at least how I like to look at them. And I'd also like to say that I always have a particular issue when people seem to pick on one particular film. Everybody seems to have a particular black sheep of the franchise that they like to berate. And it seems to shift over time in the general consensus. Sometimes it's The Man with the Golden Gun, sometimes it's Moonraker, or View to a Kill, or sometimes even Diamonds Are Forever. And I think it would, in Diamonds' case, I think that there are two issues with simply trying to write it off as not fanciful enough or too jokey or too farcical. if you want to call it that. And I think those two key points, which I would like to hit, as it were, in this commentary, are people not understanding the context of the public awareness of and perception of Bond in 1971 and why it was such a big deal that Connery came back, and how the film plays with that, and also the notion of trying to recapture past glories, with the obvious inspiration being Goldfinger. But then the second is the fact that the film never is really a farce. In fact, I look at it much more as, in many ways, an absolutely brilliant work of satirical fiction. It has most of the great elements of being a film satire, but the genius of Diamonds Are Forever, the film, is that it never lets the satire and the humor overwhelm the straight through line of the story. Bond is still himself, while everything else around him is tilted slightly in a sort of wacky way, but it never crosses that believability line, I don't think. There are some things that are a little on the silly side, admittedly, but it's a certain sort of sardonic wackiness, because at this point, this is the 7th film in the series, and you got to do something new at this point, not only to reintroduce audiences to Bond, to bring audiences back after a film that everyone concerned viewed as a failure due to the lower box office and reception in 1969, but also you have to find ways to continue the series to sort of address some of the leftover stuff from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but also how to re-engage with your audience who knows the score at this point. Every audience knows what to expect from a Bond film. And I think that's the key importance of why Diamonds Are Forever works. And I think the most important thing is you have to look at it from the context of being a cinema goer in 1971, particularly in the States, because Diamonds Are Forever is really designed to appeal to the U.S. market, much more so than any of the previous films in the series. So that's my little spiel to kick off this commentary. So if you will, go ahead and grab whichever version of the film you wish and go ahead and cue it up to the very beginning. Of course, we'll do a rough sync like my previous tracks, and do keep in mind it's a rough sync, so these are not professionally recorded, and every different edition usually has slightly different logos and things. So once we do the count-in, I try and wait for the opening logos to finish, and so I pretty much start talking over the gun barrel. So do keep in mind, if you do have to pause and adjust your particular version, if you're watching the film with this commentary, just do keep that in mind. These are all rough syncs. Of course, it would help if every version of the film had the exact same timings, but it is what it is. Also, as always, if you're looking at a more modern version of the film, please take the time to go to the audio selection options and select the original mono track if it is available on your particular release you're looking at. This film has a 5.1 remix, which, as with all the remixes of the Bond films, I really can't stand, particularly the added and changed effects and levels. And I think it is advisable to always see the films with their original sound design intact. So do go ahead and do that if you have the option. Unfortunately, for example, the Blu-rays in foreign territories outside the U.S. Lack the original audio. That's only present on the USA Blu-ray releases in Region A. So with that being said, let's go ahead and do a rough count-in. And let's get it queued up here. So get yourself queued to the 0 minute and 0 second mark. And in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So now we're into the gun barrel, which of course reuses the Sean gun barrel, but already John Barry has a beautiful gun barrel theme, which is similar in stylings musically to what we heard in You Only Live Twice, with the sort of very thin, twangy guitar rendering of the James Bond theme. And John Barry's score throughout sells the new tone of the film, which is very slinky, and that's why his entire score is slinky. And here in the opening pre-titles, you get the full birth of the Mankiewicz wit in Bond. Beatific scene shattered by Bond on a mission of revenge. And we get this wonderful suspenseful buildup because, of course, we don't see Connery at all. But everyone in the audience at this point is waiting for him. We know it's Sean, and everybody is just starting to build this anticipation because we get this nice delay with these wonderfully on the nose, literally on the nose, with the hit me gag here. And of course, it's Bond tracking down Blofeld, obviously from the previous film. Now, an interesting note here, when we get to Marie, there's an extra shot of Bond in the trailer, and then the line reading here, we first see Connery, and we're so excited, but the line reading in the dubbing is a little funnily delivered very quickly, which you can actually hear the on-set version in the trailer, which actually sounds better. This is just a wonderful gag here. It's just, it's inspired. It's a little on the cruel side, obviously, but it's just undercut with the right amount of humor. And, some people like to say that in the Connery era, Bond is obviously much crueler to the female characters, which I think really you only see in the Guy Hamilton films. I think that certain tonality is actually only present in the Guy Hamilton films. And you see it a little bit in, not really in Live and Let Die, but of course it pops up again in The Man with the Golden Gun, where the scene with Andrea Anders in her hotel room is probably the most notorious in that regard for really being not working. Now, this, of course, is the setting up the main plot idea of the film, with Blofeld creating doubles of himself. Bond trailing Blofeld allows us brilliantly to address On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and we think get it out of the way because Bond manages to kill Blofeld. Now, although the film really ditches with the novel, we do get many scenes like this one that are directly inspired. I've always loved the flip that Sean does, that little front flip. Of course, it's funny, if you look closely, he gets hit with a little bit of the mud, which were actually rotted mashed potatoes, and the poor stuntman here really had a miserable time. Of course, when Sean gets up, Bond is immaculately dressed again. But this, of course, references the horrendous mud bath scene in Fleming's novel, which is one of those passages so beautifully described in Fleming's prose that it just burns itself into your brain. I've always loved the way that Bond just sprays off the face. We get this lovely reaction shot, and then the face slowly sinks back with all of this, this lovely sound effects usage. And we're introduced to our new Blofeld, played by Charles Gray, the third of the on-screen Blofelds. And fitting in tone with the new tonality of the film, this Blofeld is completely different. But again, the fun part about this sequence is it allows us to address the loose ends of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, set up the audience, and we think, okay, we've done this, we've gotten away. By the way that Sean just lifts his hands up there as if he has no care in the world is just beautiful. And yes, the mousetrap gag's a little silly. I do want to mention, though, this whole fight scene here, for some reason, I've always felt the staging is really off. It's just something about it. It just never works. Every shot is held a little too long, but it is sold by Connery's performance and John Barry's cue, which just leaps into action, which he does frequently throughout the film. And the ending works. Charles Gray's face is a little bloodied. He gets that slight reaction. His hand goes out. And then to further cap off the death via mud bath, Bond kills him in the steaming mud. And Sean has this just look of sheer happiness on his face when he says, "Welcome to Hell, Blofeld." And then the beautiful transition into the title sequence. Maurice Binder coming back, of course. And it's a much more subdued title sequence, which it doesn't quite stand out as much, but it does fit, of course, the theme of the film. We've got diamonds everywhere, but it beautifully goes with the title song, which, going into the obvious attempts to reproduce the Goldfinger success, we of course have John Barry doing the song, Don Black doing the lyrics, and Shirley Bassey returning for her second of her 3 iconic Bond title songs. And it has this beautiful, again, the key word is slinkiness. I think it's well known now that, of course, the lyrics are, very highly suggestive in a wink, wink, nudge, nudge way. Of course, Shirley was, of course, instructed to act as if the lyrics were not about diamonds. This is pretty obvious. And once again, as on Goldfinger, Harry Saltzman absolutely hated the title song, and it drove John Barry to absolute frustration. As Barry would put it, Harry had not a musical bone in his body. Now, I have always loved the fact that we see the cat sort of slinking around, and one can only imagine trying to get the cat to cooperate throughout the titles. As it is funny to think about every time Binder would shoot one of these title sequences, all the things he would have to do and all the things that would go wrong. Now, we do have the return of most of the key production crew of the original films, but the big returning factor here is Ted Moore coming back as the cinematographer. Now, of course, the biggest difference is the fact that Peter Hunt is no longer associated with the series, and I think that's the biggest thing you feel, is that the films no longer move in the same way, and it really is something you have to get used to, and that's the key thing that makes Diamonds immediately feel different. We don't have Peter Hunt's slam editing, the editing style he perfected by the time of Under Majesty's Secret Service, which followed his editing style to a T while allowing him to experiment more in the direction of the film. So I think that's the key difference. And of course, you see this film was edited by two editors. Burt Bates would come back and work on Live and Let Die, but it does have a more relaxed feel to it, which it's also interesting because it still hits that magic 2-hour runtime. So it feels relaxed. It feels longer than it is, but it's kept relatively tight in terms of the runtime. So I think that helps. It doesn't overstay its welcome. And then the biggest attempt to try and recapture the Goldfinger touch is bringing back Guy Hamilton. And I think that was really a genius move, because if, Peter Hunt leaves and everyone oh, by the way, I have to mention the way that Sean looks in that little reflection. It shows his ease at coming back in what was obviously a bit of a trying time. Obviously there were tensions on the set. Sean had made his beef with the producers a publicly known fact, but he carries himself with such assurance and was, a complete professional that I think he actually, it looks like he enjoys this film much more than he had enjoyed the films in quite some time. And of course, the focus is much narrower. Bond is the active participant throughout, which was not the case on You Only Live Twice. But anyway, Hamilton coming back, you needed somebody who knew the films. You needed you needed assurance. You needed a relaxed quality. The line here about Bond being on holiday could be, and most likely is, a nod to Connery being away from the series. But as with all three of the Mankiewicz written films, you have to look very closely at every single line half the time, because a lot of the stuff he does, you don't notice the first, second, fifth, 10th go around. It's only sometimes when you actually look at his construction and his dialogue, and you start looking and studying the brilliance of his humor and his technique, that the full impact hits you. And of course, seeing Diamonds Are Forever as a kid, 70% of the stuff flies over your head. And then as you grow older, you start discovering more and more and more. And you're like, oh. Of course, this entire scene is literally a lift from Goldfinger and the briefing on Gold. But the fun jab at Bond is we get a reprise of the Bond making a crack about alcohol and showing off his knowledge, and M being able to get a one-up on him. But the inverse is the line about the sherry and the vintages, which actually that was where Tom Mankiewicz made a mistake, and it was, I believe he said it was Cubby Broccoli's lawyer, who was a sherry aficionado, that was like, yeah, that's a mistake. Otherwise it would have stayed in the film. But what's great about this is already we're cutting to the diamond pipeline, and it's not just a static scene as it is in Goldfinger. Goldfinger, it's a very tight scene, but there's no cutaways. So anytime you have the setting up of the plot, if you're not doing anything, it's very easy for it to get boring. And this is all done silently, so you're able to see the pipeline in action. It's capped off here by this wonderful gag of the worker coming in to the dentist's office, but with perfectly white teeth. And now we're introduced to the film's version of Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, which is just a sublime creation of everyone involved. I mean, these two are so utterly fascinating, so wonderfully charming, and completely devoted to their job of simply killing people that it takes the characters who are really, I mean, they're interesting in Fleming's novel, but they don't have this wonderful, delicious malevolence. And I mean, these two are a film in and of themselves, the way they complete each other's sentences. And yes, I think a lot has been made of the fact that they are, portrayed as gay characters, but there's nothing in the film that says that that's a bad thing. It's just an additional facet of their interesting relationship. And of course, that was also something alluded to in Fleming's novel as well about these two. So it's not something new that was introduced. But I think it's this humor that makes them just so endearing, and really, you almost wish they had a film series in and of themselves. Like I would pay good money to see a Wint and Kidd film. Of course, originally this scene was even darker, seeing as the character was a dentist. The script was to have had the scorpion put in the dentist's mouth. But of course, that was viewed as too nasty, so they shot it this way instead, which is still beautifully played. And we have the nice, inherently funny shot of them having to shuffle the body over right as the helicopter lands. And again, it's this slow, methodical process of shutting down the pipeline and moving the action along that, very much like a caper film, involves the audience, gets everybody engaged in this world the film is going to create, and we're not still in Sir Donald's office, getting the plot spelled out. We're moving along, and we're also seeing, as evidenced in the line coming up, if they close down the pipeline before we find out what's going on, we'll never know what's going on. And here's the most that's said about their relationship in the film: the moment when they walk off and Wint and Kidd hold hands. It's a bizarre little image that just it manages to cap the whole scene off. It really does. And of course, with every Bond film, you have to present the problem. And I think this scene does a remarkable job at showing the new relaxed atmosphere, also letting the audience become re-engaged in a Bond film. Again, I do have to point out this is Ted Moore coming back to the series, which was the first film he did after Thunderball, and seeing as he's the key cinematographer, Diamonds looks like a Bond film. It has the scope, the feel. Every shot is wonderfully composed, even though it is not the same over-the-top, ultra-elaborate production design all the way through. And Ken Adam comes back as well, and I love this set even, this little set of, Mrs. Whistler's, suppose it's a missionary home in South Africa. It's not the over-elaborate stuff that Ken Adam has immediately thought of, but he was such a brilliant production designer. He could do things like that in sort of Sir Donald's office here and make it believable down to the last detail. So I think you get that's two examples of literally, the old crew coming back together, the family atmosphere the Bond productions were known for. And of course, this also gives us the Bond and M office scene, but out of the office. So it's a way of freshening the traditional M presents the problem scene. But of course, that means we don't get our flirtation with Moneypenny, which is why it's delayed to the end of this sequence when Bond leaves passport control. And now we're introduced to Peter Franks, who will be the patsy of sorts and be the source of Bond's cover. But now, since we get to see him here, now we know what he physically looks like, and we'll then recognize the danger when, of course, he escapes later, and that will set up the brilliant staging of the elevator fight sequence. And this is wonderful staging here. Moneypenny slips out in the customs outfit, and we get the usual byplay, but it's very short here. But even though it is short, it's Lois Maxwell and Connery both bring that original sparkle back. And even though this is short, and even though Moneypenny says she'd like a diamond and a ring, which is really insensitive, considering that Bond's wife had just been murdered, if we're doing OHMSS, but it's just beautifully delivered. So, and it transitions with Barry's cue over into this wonderful little transition of Bond on hovercraft, which of course hovercrafts would have been very, gee whiz for 1971, and Bond, of course, would take the most fantastical mode of transportation over to Amsterdam. And we get this lovely little transition here, which sets up Amsterdam circa 1971. And again, there's some nice time capsule pieces about this film. We get to see Amsterdam, but most particularly, we get to see Las Vegas as it was in 1971, which, of course, now it is totally different. And so in a lot of ways, this film sort of shares a similarity with the original Ocean's 11 for being a time capsule of how Las Vegas was at the time it was shot. And we are furthering the plot of the pipeline being shut down. Love the comedy of the tour guide going, oh! And of course, it is Mrs. Whistler. And then the wonderful transition here to Wenton Kidd taking photos of her body. Picture of the canals for the children. It's just... Oh God, it's such a shame we didn't get a Wenton Kidd film. It really is. It almost has the perverse humor of the Dr. Phibes films, I think. So this, of course, is Bond arriving to meet Tiffany Case for the first time, and again, already you could feel the film moves at its own definite pace, but it's relaxed. That's such an interesting notion, that a Bond film is assured as always, but in a lot of ways, it's like we're able to watch Connery stretch out and feel the role again, and we're allowed to savor it and enjoy it. So it still moves along, but I think this scene right here in particular, where Bond and Tiffany meet for the first time, but if you look at the way that Sean plays this whole scene, every bit of his actions are just delicious to watch. We get the little back and forth of Tiffany coming in and out with different wigs on and different clothes. So there's a bit of mystery, but Bond searches the room with his eyes, and we have the interplay with the dialogue, and we get Bond, of course, where it's later revealed he has the false fingerprints on, but when he examines the glass and he sniffs the talcum powder that's been hastily wiped off, it's just the way that he has this. It's not an aloofness, but it's a feigned aloofness, because of course Bond is playing a role here as Peter Franks, but he's having fun with this. That's the key. That's what's been missing in the Connery performances outside of, I think, the best character pieces in Thunderball, because Thunderball was the point at which the scope became epic and the focus shifted away from Bond as your character and your through line throughout. So there's this wonderful relaxed quality throughout the film that I've always found interesting, and I've grown to appreciate more and more over the years as I grow older and I rewatch the film ad nauseum. So it doesn't rush itself, which is something that Guy Hamilton was kind of known for, and something that drove Peter Hunt a little crazy, apparently, on Goldfinger, which is why Goldfinger moves in the style of the Terrence Young films and has a very short runtime, but it feels looser. And Peter Hunt said that he had to, in his words, bash the pieces together to try and get it more like the first two films. So, of course, Hunt not being on Diamonds Are Forever, it obviously much more closely resembles Guy Hamilton's other films. But key is the fact that the editors here still kept it to 2 hours. And, of course, that was probably also because OHMSS ran, an extra reel or two, which meant less showtimes. And so I'm sure everybody was not wanting to repeat that as well, because 2 hours is really the magic number for a Bond film and most any film, 90 minutes to 2 hours. But Bond really requires about 2 hours. Now, here's the moment with the glass, and John Barry just scores the hell out of this scene. It's a very light piece. It's actually very reminiscent of the track Try, which is called that on the soundtrack in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, when Bond and Tracy are talking over the table in the casino. So it's interesting to note some similarities, between the film scores, which you can do that. Obviously, the same composer, but this is the key musical similarity, I think, to OHMSS. But it's still got a slinkier vibe to it, and I think the instant that Sean's agreed he would come back, and John Barry came on board, he knew exactly what he had to do and how to achieve it musically. And he achieves a certain balance, I think. There are lighter pieces and there is the traditional Bond darkness. And I think that he wanted to have more of that darkness, but he had to curtail that quite a bit to match the lighter tone and the shift in the tonality of the film, and I think it's brilliant. Now, this is a gag. It's a sight gag. If you look behind Q, you see the DBS from Under Majesty's Secret Service, but you see all these rockets being clumsily loaded, aborted. That's something you miss, particularly in the older pan and scan versions of the film. But that's just a hilarious gag about how ridiculous some of Q's gadgets can get as they're just trying to cram like 6 or 7 big rockets in the hood of this Aston Martin. It's just brilliant. Just like this here, where Bond is introduced outside the apartment, and one of my favorite gags in the whole series, Bond making love to himself. I mean, I think only Sean could really sell that, because as soon as he looks up, he still has murder in his eyes. And it's capped off here by Bond playing the hysterically bad accent. You are English? I speak English. Who is your floor? I mean, it's just the right element of perverse humor, because, again, everybody in the audience knows that, that Peter Franks is not long for this world. And this sets up the elevator fight, which was Guy Hamilton's idea about putting Bond and assailant, 2 big strapping guys just do a fight. But how do you make it fresh? Well, cram them in the tiniest space possible and make it this crappy, slow little elevator in an Amsterdam, like 2 or 3 level apartment. So it's this crappy elevator that moves so slowly, but I mean, they smash all the glass, they get in there, and this really becomes one of the best fights in the series. And it's really funny that you have this great fight, and we have the pre-title sequence fight that's so underwhelming. But people want to say Diamonds is too silly, but again, Bond's life is threatened throughout. It does have serious stakes, and this is a really gritty little fight, even though it has this wonderful undercurrent of humor. Here, Bond's head is going to be crushed in the rising wall, and as soon as we see the danger, that's when John Barry kicks in. So I think the music editing itself, the cue placement, is really well done. It doesn't score everything, but it cuts right in when the danger becomes fully apparent in the fight sequences. So that makes the main danger motif we get here, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Pardon my humming. But it makes it so much more visceral, especially the little musical stabs. And this will happen in the other major fight sequences of the film. But again, it's that editing of exactly where the music is started that enhances it. I always love the moment where it's timed exactly to the 2 little karate blows that Sean makes. And again, it's still quite visceral. And the fact that Bond disarms him with the fire hose, you see Connery break into a grin. It's that particular dark, malevolent humor, that undercurrent that Sean always had, and Diamonds really excels in bringing out. And Tom Mankiewicz always liked to talk about how you had to write for the different actors slightly differently. So he realized he could write for Sean, but when it switched over to Roger Moore in Live and Let Die, he had to do things differently. You couldn't do it exactly the same way. And I think it was important that he made this conscious effort to do this, because I do think that's important. Whereas I think Richard Maybaum, who is the other credited screenwriter on Diamonds, and really the series' primary scribe, I think Maybaum so innately knew the character of Bond they had created. I think that he would write the scripts with the Bond they had created in mind, and then from there, the actor, director, and everybody else, and of course in successive drafts, it would be developed. Whereas I think Tom Mankiewicz actually made a dedicated choice in a lot of the dialogue and scenarios to tilt it, to tailor it, as it were, towards the specific talents of Connery or Roger Moore. And of course, Maybum did this as well. Any screenwriter does, but I think Tom Mankiewicz maybe pushed that a bit further. And there's this wonderful slyness that I think also comes from the fact that Mankiewicz and Guy Hamilton really hit it off and developed this rapport and working relationship that led them to cooking up ideas and especially the snake pit scenarios they would come up with to put Bond in. And that's why the snake pit scenarios really ramp up in the three Tom Mankiewicz primarily written films, as I say, the Mankiewicz trilogy. And I think Sean picks up on this because, of course, he and Terrence Young had cooked up a lot of the humorous bits on set originally and helped to establish the inherent dark humor of Bond. And I do think the increase in humor was an interesting way to make this sellable to American audiences, who are obviously the primary target audience, as it were, for this film. Because, the American market was the biggest market, UA was an American company, and you really had to hit the American market to sell this film, and then, the worldwide box office would follow with the word of mouth and everything else. Of course, since the film primarily takes place in America, the original idea in the pre-production was to shoot the film entirely in America and base it at Universal Studios, which a lot of people want to say because the film has a smaller scale that critics have often labeled it as seeming TV movie-ish, which I think is extraordinarily unfair. This film is beautifully shot and beautifully designed, and of course they shot all of the interiors at Pinewood Studios, so they kept the core Bond gloss, but they're allowed to go play in America. So I think that's another key distinction, because had they shot it at Universal, I think it would have been very different. And I think that TV movie idea would have been a lot more applicable there. Well, this is one of my favorite gags in the series. This is Tom Mankiewicz's Alimentary Dr. Later, which apparently Cubby Broccoli hated, saying that nobody would get it. And of course, two people laughed at the premiere, and, Tom was like, yes, we're vindicated. Cubby turns around, big deal, two doctors. And of course, this is Norman Burton as the film's version of Felix Leiter. There, Mark Lawrence appears for the first time. He, of course, comes back, the man with the golden gun. And it's interesting seeing him as he is a veteran of many Hollywood films, usually in the gangster roles, such as in Key Largo. But anyway, I like that the film plays around in the States. It does, obviously have a smaller scale. As a kid, I always felt it a little weird when Bond would just go around the U.S. because, being from the U.S. myself, it was like, no, we want to go across the world. And we don't need to see Bond going around, my backyard, as it were. It just felt strange. But what's interesting about Diamonds is it takes the simplicity of the novel, which, of course, primarily takes place in Las Vegas, and Bond simply follows the diamond smuggling trail. It's an earlier Fleming novel, so it follows that with the Fleming sweep, it is full of action. It moves at a good clip, but if you start to question it, it's relatively straightforward. It's by far and away the most straightforward of all of Fleming's plots. But the film actually replicates this, but builds upon it, and I think it's represented here by Slumber Inc. It's all about what's underneath the surface. There's a lot more going on in what is seemingly an ordinary setting. Now, this interior Ken Adam designed is just this whole thing is glorious. Of course, this is primarily a real location, which you can actually still visit. I believe it's still a mortuary. I'm not for certain. But it's this particular interesting, again, this morbid humor. We're following along, and we're in on the joke with Bond. Bond is having to sit through this, and he's sort of like amusingly perturbed that he's having to play along with this charade. And we have this wonderfully overblown funereal sequence, and of course it's the body of Peter Franks, who Bond murdered coldly a short while ago. And of course this is David Bower, who returns after playing the small bit part of the U.S. diplomat in You Only Live Twice. And of course, being the second major You Only Live Twice veteran returning in the cast of Diamonds Are Forever. And then just playing along, the music cuts off. We go back to this wonderfully tawdry the organ backing music, and just these wonderful humorous lines about it having to do with funerals and all this stuff. And it's obviously, plays on words, because this apparently is part of the plan for Peter Franks ostensibly to get his payment. Of course, this happens in the novel, but that leads into the whole sequence about horse races and Bond having, as undercover, having to place bets on a crooked horse race, and then all that going wrong. And of course, that takes a significant chunk out of the novel before Bond even gets to Vegas. And so it does make sense why that was dropped. This scene takes that entire sequence's place, moves everything along, and continues this morbid and humorous and winking, sly fun, but it gets Bond from that same point A to point B, but without having the whole long Saratoga Springs sequence of the novel. Always loved that very malicious close-up of slumber, and of course the name Morton Slumber. Slumber Inc. It's just, it's glorious. And because, of course, we've already seen Winton Kidd kill several members of the pipeline, just seeing them appear here, you really don't have to see anything else. And it's interesting that they're putting the flowers on, because they are, obviously the physical attendants of death itself, ostensibly for Peter Franks. But this will obviously not be, because this is Bond. But it's interesting here, Bond gets knocked out and gets put into the major snake pit scenario of the film. And so it does still show that Bond is human, and we get this I'm sure it was slightly intended to show Bond just drug off as slightly humorous. Now we're introduced to Shady Tree, of course, a character from the novel, but changed for the film, and just the casting of Diamonds is just so interesting. The not only the character actors used, but the non-actors. Putter Smith here is actually a jazz musician who Guy Hamilton spotted and cast merely for his look and presence, which I think was another inspired moment of casting that was pretty much spurred on by Guy Hamilton seeing somebody interesting, as he had for Harold Sakata for the role of Oddjob and Goldfinger. Another beautiful finishing of the sentences. And then this wonderful shot where it's almost like they're in unified slow motion going out of the doors. Now, this is the snake pit of the film, where Bond is placed inside the crematorium, inside the coffin, and there is literally no way out. And you have to sit there, as Guy Hamilton liked to explain, and it's like, all right, audience, you've got a minute to figure out how Bond is going to get out of this. And ironically, these were, I'm sure it was actually planned, these were the last shots that Connery filmed on the film, and it was his second goodbye to the role of James Bond when production finished. So I think it had to have been planned. It's just too cheeky and ironic to have not been planned that way. And how does Bond get out? It's a bit of a cheat, because, of course, Bond doesn't get out of his own ingenuity, but, of course, since he planted false diamonds, they obviously can't kill him until they find out where the real diamonds are, which sets up the next bit of the film, where the enemies have to then try to figure out where this Peter Franks has hidden the diamonds. And of course, it's odd that they just let him go, if you want to look at it that way. But Bond just jumps out, and Hotel Tropicana is quite comfortable. My condolences, gentlemen. And then we get the frustrated slumber slamming it shut. And it's just, you have to look at every single little moment. And, Ken Adam designs all the Vegas stuff to have this very gaudiness to it, which, of course, definitely fits 71 Vegas. But humorously, if you look at all the production materials, he didn't really want to make it gaudy, because, in his words, people will think that I have designed this, Of course, all the shots of the White House are an optical. They took the real hotel and substituted the created for the film White House. And, of course, that sets up the character of Willard White, obviously based on Howard Hughes, who was a great and longtime friend of Cubby Broccoli's. And this is why we get the whole reclusive billionaire. And the idea was to make Blofeld someone who had kidnapped the Howard Hughes type character. This came about because Cubby Broccoli had a dream that he went to see his old friend and sequestered away in his hidden palaces and such, and the chair turns around and it was an imposter. So this is the key that gave the writers the impetus for how the film would go, because originally it started with a Maybaum draft that was very, very patterned after Goldfinger, right down to having Goldfinger's identical twin brother coming back, who would have also been played by Gert Frobe, who would have had some sort of super tanker with a laser device. And so the super tanker would, of course, pop up later in The Spy Who Loved Me, because the producers never would throw away something that, hadn't gotten used yet. But anyway, and there was this great Maybaum line that he was so sad that never got used. Of course, Goldfinger's brother had this wonderful line, Mr. Bond, I believe you knew my brother Auric. Mother always said he was a bit retarded. Now, of course, when the kid will remove Shady Tree from the proceedings, there was a little deleted scene showing the actual killing of Tree. There are a number of small deleted scenes that are actually viewable. They have been presented on the home video releases. The funny part of this is, of course, Saxby pops up, saying, "We need Tree alive." That's most annoying, because, of course, the funniness is that they've already killed him. Now, interestingly, Saxby is played by Bruce Cabot, who was a long-time Hollywood actor. He appears in the original King Kong, and apparently was a friend of Cubby Broccoli's, who knew Cabot was not doing super well financially and could use a significant paycheck. So they actually structured it to keep him on the film for some time, which is, of course, another example of what you always hear about the Bond films being a family atmosphere of sorts, which is a very key and important factor. Of course, we keep talking about Cubby Broccoli, and this was one of the films that he took the reins in producing, so Harry Saltzman was much more of a background player. And again, interestingly, the way I like to look at this back and forth alternating, all the films that Cubby had more say in as the on-set producer, as it were, like we see in Diamonds, they're much more high living and less of the gritty, down-to-earth, realistic spy story. And immediately the next film, Live and Let Die, you do see a bit of that switch and return to more of the Dr. No feel, which I think fits that was primarily produced by Harry Saltzman. So here we are introduced to Plenty O'Toole, played by Lana Wood, who was actually a friend of Tom Mankiewicz's. And all of the suggestive double entendre dialogue and the name Plenty O'Toole is all Mankiewicz, and just so brilliantly on the nose. It never goes too far, never becomes tawdry, but again, it's sublime when you really look at it. The whole back and forth of, Plenty O'Toole, named after your father, perhaps. And you can see the joy in which Sean plays all of this. I mean, he's having fun. He was very underrated for his comedic timing, which he was brilliant at, and that's what makes all the underplaying of the one-liners work. And it's also examined here. Bond tells, he wants to do all these rules and things. He wants to play this way. She says, "Say, you've played this game before. Just once." It's the underplaying that makes even little moments like that, the way he flicks his eyes around. I mean, it has to be understood how huge this was in 1971, because Connery as Bond is one of the most iconic performers in a role that cinemagoers had ever seen. So you bought a ticket to Diamonds Are Forever, you knew what you were buying a ticket to, whether you'd seen one Bond film, whether you'd seen all of them. And it then became the challenge of you had to deliver this and make it fresh. And that's what Diamonds Are Forever does. And people could relax and enjoy an entertainment. It wasn't a hard-hitting spy story. And of course, the irony is that's what the film started out as. And then got to the point, as here in Diamonds, where we would sort of alternate between the lighter entertainment and the hard-hitting spy story. So Diamonds is firmly in that one camp of being the entertainment. Now, originally, there was a long scene of Plenty and Bond going to a restaurant, Bond rejecting the fancy wine and showing off his connoisseurship, but I think it was wise to delete that, even though it was, obviously a very 70s Vegas location, because when you see that scene, it just really doesn't work. And we move the film much more quickly by immediately cutting to here, and you don't miss that sequence. We get the wonderful introduction of the very, cliched hoods, inside the room in the dark. And then the brilliantly perverse moment of throwing the nude plenty out the window. And of course, they literally did this for real, obviously from a much lower distance, in the middle of the night in Vegas. And the funny bit is, it was supposed to be cleared. And by the time they went to shoot it, Lana Wood has said that, there's all these people lined up and stuff to simply watch her be thrown out of a third story window, naked from the top up. Again, important here that we still have elements of mystery. They leave Bond to his own devices, and immediately Bond pulls the PPK out, opens the door with his foot, and then sees the purse there. Good evening, Miss Case. Again, even though the film has a sillier vibe to it throughout, even though it's satirical, Bond is still intelligent, and it's him playing the game that's set up for Peter Franks. It's the joy that Sean has in the role that makes all this stuff work, because Bond is playing a part here, and he's having fun at toying with the criminal players, as it were. Of course, we don't know it's Spectre yet. And here it's underlined in this back and forth and the bed scene with Tiffany Case, who is obviously trying to manipulate this Peter Franks. And Bond underlines it, presumably I'm the condemned man and you're the hearty breakfast. I love the bit that Bond hangs the tux on the light fixture and is standing around ostensibly naked, and then cuts the lights, and that's when we cut to them in bed. And then the staging here, I thought was interesting, the way that the ashtray is presented on the iconic Connery chest hair. And then she just crushes her cigarette when she's essentially threatening Peter Franks. She crushes the cigarette in the ashtray, literally on him. She's just a lovely bit of staging I've always enjoyed. And then when Bond turns away, you see the look in Sean's eyes. It's like, oh, should I think it got me? Little do they know. And of course, as always, you can see his iconic arm tattoo covered up with the patch of makeup if you want to look really close. Again, it's fun hearing these plans that have no basis in reality that Tiffany is spouting, and the way that she's, acting as the Black Widow to entice Peter Franks to give up the diamonds, and then Bond as Franks is just basically handing it to her on a platter, when of course the whole setup is that eventually, Q has just arrived with the diamonds, and they will provide the diamonds to allow Bond to progress through the pipeline. Of course, not realizing that Bond is pretty much getting a clear idea that the whole notion is to kill him once they get the diamonds, but Bond will avoid that and be able to progress further down the pipeline before it is shut off. So there is an element of the unforeseen future that keeps things still relatively realistic, but this is all examining the plot and minute detail. You're not supposed to do that in this film. Again, you're supposed to be entertained, and you're supposed to be, see things out of the ordinary. And I think the humor helps sells the fact that, even though it's out of the ordinary stuff, I've always liked the fact that it's behind the scenes. So while seeing Circus Circus Casino now isn't as, impressive as it was, because Circus Circus was relatively new when the film was shot there. They hadn't even built their hotel yet. I think it had been open a couple years by this point. But the notion of there being a novelty casino that went to this level of ambiance and setup, was much more of a big thing in 1971 than compared to now, when there's so many in Vegas. But now we get to see the wonderful time capsule aspect, because of course this is the real Circus Circus. We see real people, as we do in all the casino sequences shown in the film. So again, that makes Diamonds Are Forever have that feeling that we get in the 1960 Ocean's 11, where we get to see Vegas circa 1960. So the comedy here also comes from the fact that the CIA is essentially, they do their job, but the inherent ineptness of the agents and Felix Leiter's line, "Relax, I've got upwards of 30 agents down there. A mouse with sneakers couldn't get through." And of course, obviously, we know as soon as that line happens that Tiffany Case will get through. I've always liked the way Jill St. John plays the role. She has the required like brassiness that Fleming's heroine did. But unfortunately, after a certain point, Tiffany sort of loses all that spunk, and by the end of the film, she just kind of stumbles around as a helpless bimbo, which is unfortunate, because Tiffany Case is one of the best, strongest female roles in the Fleming canon. And of course, the end of the Diamonds Are Forever novel, it's alluded to that she moves into Bond's flat for a while and is one of the great relationships of his life. Now here we have the payoff to the scene earlier. Bond is going to rent the car just in case she shows up. And the line about, her devotion to larceny versus my incomparable charm. Now, of course, when you see this film for the first time, if you want to look at this, the idea of a kid's water balloon game in the middle of a Bond film, it just seems bizarre. But it is a slight element of the bizarre that I think makes the film stand on its own. It works in just a strange way, and the way that Tiffany just looks away and is just like, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen." It's just bizarre enough. And of course, we get this later, just after this, with the Zambora scene with the whole gorilla woman transformation. And of course, Tiffany Case had to get the diamonds somehow, but if you want to study this again, which you're not supposed to do, it's slightly bizarre. And of course, this was a child actor at the time who gets to point out that the machine is fixed, something's going on, and all the CIA guys have to turn around. She only had one win. It's like, oh, we got to take care of this kid. And then the actual the guy who runs it is almost like trying to keep his manic quality in when he's like, "Give it a rest, kid." This is admittedly one of the gags that may go a little too far, with the elephant hitting the jackpot on 3 elephants. It's so short, and it's just cute enough, and it doesn't derail the film, so it's okay. Same thing with the shot here of the agents walking through the funhouse mirror and shown to be tiny, goofy-looking guys. Again, it's little moments using what was there on location. I think they work. You wouldn't have gotten that obviously in the Terrence Young films to that same goofier level, but they work in the context of the film. They don't derail things. Again, it's still got that narrative drive. And if it didn't have that, then we'd have a lot of problems. But again, everything keeps moving, even though we get this. Why this is here? This was a thing that was actually there, and the guy playing the scientist with the beautifully goofy, terrible acting and accent is actually the guy who ran Circus Circus. Part of their deal was they could use Circus Circus if he could be in the film somewhere. So. Again, slightly bizarre. Again, you see the kids who as extras laughing at this. Some are actually scared looking, which it sells it, but it is something you hadn't seen before. This is how Tiffany will escape from the CIA, and they show their slight ineptitude once again. So it works. It's not too long. It serves a purpose, even though it is definitely very much on the bizarre side. But again, that undercurrent of humor does sell it. So we get this scene here. The kids run away. But again, it does allow Tiffany to escape from the CIA minders who are right there. We hit the lines on the soundtrack. We see her go through the back door. And then John Barry's music comes in. Again, perfect sound editing to sell the drama of the scene when it's exactly necessary. And then we get the pullback where she's nowhere to be seen. Of course, it begs the question, how did she get away that fast? But of course, she got the drop on them. And then Felix Leiter appears in complete shame. Don't tell me you lost her. We lost her. It's also interesting to see Bond in such a non-Bond like car. It's always funny when you see those. Now, this was apparently actually Kirk Douglas's house in Palm Springs where they shot this sequence. Love how Bond is just waiting for Tiffany at her own house. This is also apparently the house where Ursula Andress actually decided to do Dr. No. She'd been sent the script, and it was at a party at Kirk Douglas's house, which I assume means this house, where they encouraged her that she had to do it, that the script was so much fun. Now, Plenty shows up and was obviously killed by Winton Kidd, as Bond alludes to, but this isn't explained except for in dialogue. Originally, there was a deleted sequence where Plenty goes back to the hotel room and finds Tiffany Case's address in her purse and resolves to go there ostensibly to get revenge somehow. And the inherent humor is, of course, that Winton Kidd have killed the wrong person without realizing it. And Tiffany realizes that she was to have been killed next, and Bond reveals that they've missed him once already. They've killed others. This is the point where her conflicts arise and her loyalty starts to shift. Now, this is the moment in the film where Bond slaps Tiffany there so coldly. That's the bit in the film. It's very small, but that's the one little note, and where Bond says, you find it rather difficult to breathe underwater. Now, where's the stuff? It's very hard, and you're not the type to turn the other cheek. It's very, that's what I think people pick up on and seem to reference a lot, and they talk about it as if it's just something that Sean Connery had. Whereas really, it's something that I think only get in the Guy Hamilton films. That sort of callousness every once in a while towards, as Hamilton would put it, because he just mentions it once or twice in some of the interviews and commentaries and things, where because people did say some stuff at the time a little bit about things like that, but Hamilton always felt that Bond as a character would occasionally, if necessary, it could be a little on the rough side with the ladies about, as it were. And you really don't get that in the Terrence Young films if we're looking specifically at the early ones. And it's not in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, obviously. So I think that's actually a particular thing that Guy Hamilton did, a particular element that I think people do kind of see. And for me in Diamonds, it's just that one moment where Bond is very rough with Tiffany. But of course, it's really rough more in tone and so sudden. But of course, he's having to try and break through her bravado and her posturing and say, like, all these people are dead now. And he's having to do this because, of course, he has to find out where the diamonds went, because if they get picked up before he gets to the airport, then obviously they would have lost the trail, which would have been an interesting thing to see. Like, well, we put the diamonds there, and then she took them. Where'd they go? I have no idea, Shah. And now we're introduced to Dr. Metz for the first time, who is the marvelously wonderful fuss budget of the film, if you want to use that term, who just gets so beautifully angry about anything. He gets so irritated, which makes it just wonderful here in this scene where Tiffany refuses to move the beautiful Mach 1 Mustang, which was obviously a product placement thing from Ford, and they literally gave the whole production a giant deal. Simply, if Sean was shown driving the new Mustang, the Mach 1 was pretty much new for this time, and Ford had premiered the original Mustang in Goldfinger, so there's another Goldfinger connection. But if the film showed James Bond, Sean Connery behind the wheel of a Mustang, Ford would provide all the other vehicles for the film practically free, and that's what they did. So obviously the producers jumped at that. So that's why if you look very closely, most of the major cars, right down to the white Tektronix green van here, are Fords. The opposite happened on Live and Let Die. You see a lot of Chevys, so there was a deal with Chevrolet, but Bond and Ford have a pretty long-standing history of product placement. But again, It's very minor. You only spot that after seeing the film many times, and of course hearing the story and the commentaries about Ford making that deal just if they showed James Bond behind the wheel of a Mustang. So again, the notion of mystery is here. We're going to a different location, this base out in the middle of the Nevada desert. We're going outside of Vegas, which always is well known for as soon as you go outside the Strip area, it goes back to being desert land. And of course, in the novel, the climax happens in Spectreville, one of the first times Fleming used one of his favorite words of Spectre, which was an old abandoned Wild West town where that was the main hideaway of the lead villain of Serafimo Sprang. And where he has this wonderful Wild West village and a restored train and all this stuff. And that's where Bond is taken, confronted, and given a Brooklyn stomping. Very viciously in the novel, and barely escapes with Tiffany on a handcart. So again, you can make a lot of parallels to the novel if you want to, but what this sequence sets up is the breakout where Bond gets to see the first glimpse of the Diamond satellite. Of course, he doesn't know what it's there for, but that allows him to make inflections later on when they put two and two together. And they come back to this base. And then, of course, this sets up the breakout where we see all the moon materials. Here we're introduced to poor old Klaus Hagersheimer of G-Section, who is just a wonderful patsy for Bond to be able to get in the area. And this is a beautiful bit of business. Bond pantomimes having the card and then slips in the door while doing this back and forth, pretending like he's worked this place all his life. And interestingly, he slips through the door, letting it close, so hopefully he can get away before Hergesheimer can get in. And in manipulating him in this way, he's able to get the sort of credential by getting the little, readout indicator to indicate, radiation shields. And of course, he's able to then use this to get into the office and try and get information before Metz throws him out. And of course, because this has just happened, it's this wonderful, sly bit of intelligence work where Bond just, throws this information back in the enemy's face. And of course, the inherent funny bits of the fact that these secret labs have just enough window space for somebody to peer in, and Bond just literally, like a little boy, just peers in. And again, he just throws on a lab coat and just literally waltzes in. And then very much in the way that Sean does earlier playing with Peter Franks, he proudly shows off the indicator. You are Metz, how do you spell? It's it's all in the playing of these scenes, and you can see Sean has a field day with the wit that Tom Mankiewicz injected into this. It gives Sean something different to play, and I think you can really see a joy of performance here in the film that it's just, it's beautiful to watch. And of course, in the back, we get our first glimpse of the great countdown assistant from the oil rig climax. So again, we see these characters and this material for the first time, which all of this will come back later and pay it off. Bond first sees the tape here of World's Greatest Marches, which of course leads him to realize later on that was probably the control tape, and of course he tries to substitute a copy for the real thing. And then to lead us into the chase out of the complex, the real Klaus Hergesheimer immediately comes in. And of course, it should be pointed out, this is actually the same actor we see as the first satellite technician in Hawaii in the You Only Live Twice pre-title. Again, John Barry's Q only comes in when the ruse is revealed. Now, here's something not everybody gets. Of course, they're obviously testing out something for NASA, and it's this setup of a moon area, but this is also a totally wicked riff on the notion that the moon landings were faked. So you see they're moving around slowly, everything's staged, and they have this moon buggy. So again, the conspiracy theory that the moon landings were faked and it was done somewhere by a Hollywood crew out in the middle of the desert or something, that's what this whole setup is riffing on. So you don't have to know about that for this sequence to work. You just think, oh, they're just testing the moon buggy. And obviously they are, but inherently it is a wickedly funny riff on the notion that the moon landings were faked. And of course, this is the Ken Adam described the moon buggy design as this horrific thing. And originally, it was supposed to be on a road, but then Guy Hamilton thought it should go across the desert, which was a perfect idea, but it wasn't designed for that. So they had a lot of trouble with tires breaking and stuff, and they had to really fix up this whole chase sequence because the moon buggy kept breaking down. Sound-wise, there's interesting design here. We have the nice loud noises of the cars, and then later on of the three-wheelers, which, again, was a novel thing for 1971. But every time we cut back to the moon buggy, you have this inherently funny little whirring engine sound that contrasts beautifully with the big cars just thrashing around. And also, apparently, according to Tom Mankiewicz, Guy Hamilton hated American cars. He thought they were big and flashy and just flew all around, and he apparently took great delight in smashing them to pieces, which is, of course, why you have all these cars flopping around. Every single one wrecks or flies off like this and smashes. And, of course, Bond will practically destroy most of the Las Vegas police force's cars in the chase to follow. So, again, the three-wheelers appear for the first time, and the notion of an ATV or three-wheeler was something very much new. So it's a great example of the Bond team pulling something out that most people would consider fantastic, but is something that really existed and hadn't come to prominence yet. Again, now you see John Barry's cue come in. This was a point of contention with him and Guy Hamilton. Barry recalled that this was one of the points where he wanted it to be much darker, and Hamilton and others insisted it be lighter, so there was a bit of a back and forth. And if I recall correctly, the cue in the film and the cue on the soundtrack are mixed a little differently. But I think it achieves a perfect balance of this sort of irreverence with the light sort of xylophone usage, and then he holds the dramatic part back, and because this whole scenario is a little ridiculous, but it's just ridiculous enough. Now this cutaway allows for Bond to jump out of the moon buggy and hide behind the dune here, and then when he pops around, it's here where the seriousness comes in, and we get this wonderful kick. Connery jumps on the ATV, and then we kick into the full music section. And it has this drive to it, this seriousness to it. Because, again, Bond is barely managing to escape. And we get this nice flourish when we cut back to the empty moon buggy. Again, Bond has stolen an ATV. He floors it out. And then we get one of the best lines in the film. Tiffany asks what happened. Bond says, "Get in the car. If you see a malprofession or minibus, just smile." And then the car takes off. And we get this wonderful John Barry flourish. The Mustang kicks out, and if you notice here, he has to swerve around the ATV really quick. And then this wonderful trail off on the long shot. We see the Mustang tear off down the road, and the music is so beautifully dramatic. And the officer's tie is flapping in the wind, and we get the final line, "Get the sheriff's office." I mean, it's wonderfully dramatic. It sells that whole sequence, even though it is a bit on the silly side. Now, this is the pretty famous car chase sequence that takes place in downtown Vegas, and when you consider it, I've always wondered why this has happened. It does go on for quite a bit. It is definitely a bit long and presages the length of the boat chase in Live and Let Die in the very next film, probably going on a little bit too long. One wonders why Bond decides he has to get away from the police, because obviously the Peter Franks thing has been blown with Tiffany, so he doesn't have to keep that up. Felix Leiter is in town. So basically, the cops would take him in, and then he'd get it all explained, and then that would be it. There's no ticking time clock that he's gotta get out. But so if you want to, again, consider all this logically, Bond basically smashes up most of the Vegas police force and does a lot of damage just because. So it kind of begs the question why. But, I mean, the whole sequence is beautiful. It's got this wonderful irreverent humor. You do see some vintage cars flying around. And, again, the best moments are where you see Sean behind the wheel, which was what Ford wanted. And I love when you see the moments at speed. You see Jill St. John open mouth. It's not as effective when you see the actors playing the cops in the cop car, because that's a process shot. And sound wise, the sirens are mixed really loud, but particularly when the engine is throbbing on the Mustang, and all the shots where Bond does a handbrake turn, it's folded up really loud. But of course, if you look in the background, you see all the people lined up on the sidewalks to watch, all the onlookers, and it obviously gives it away that this is, shot on location and these are real people watching a movie. But you can explain it away by the fact that there's all these people in Vegas, and they would obviously stop when a chase like this is going on. Also, it's nice that they were able to get permission to use some of the sidewalks and pop up on there, and again, to sell the believability of this. Again, you've got all these cars thrashing around and stuff, so it is nice and visceral in that way, because they're doing this for real. Every time you hear the squealing of the tires, that's real. But what makes this sequence is this bit here in the parking lot where Bond manages to sneakily and beautifully, in such a wonderfully humorous way, cause every cop car to smash themselves up. It's also interesting, if you look here, Bond is obviously using an automatic Mustang instead of a manual, which seems a un-Bondy thing to do, but that's just something you notice after you see this film a million times. But again, I think the first section of this chase goes on a little too long, going back and forth in front of the Golden Nugget and stuff all along the strip. But this whole sequence in the parking lot section, and then Bond just glides right out on the ramp, and then of course the cop tries to come behind him and do the same thing and fails miserably. And now we have the tilting in the alley, which again sort of presages the shearing of the bus in Live and Let Die. But I think both sequences are really well built up to. But of course, this caused a large problem when the original footage had all the crowd of onlookers looking in the background, and so they had to reshoot the car on two wheels, but had a different crew, and they accidentally flipped the car on the wrong side. So that's why here in this sequence, we have, Bond say lean over, but we have this flip down in the perspective to sort of try and disguise the fact that the car goes in one way and comes out the other way. And it's simply because the second take they did was a different crew, and they did the car the wrong way, and they didn't have the time or money to go do it again. But that little bit of editing there, it does so much to try and sell this, because honestly, I didn't think about this incongruity until it was, you see it pointed out all the time. People love to point that out. But again, John Barry's music is so wonderfully dramatic and trails off with that nice slinkiness, which helps sell this transition to this wonderfully scored piece where they're suddenly in the bridal suite at the White House on this wonderfully gaudy aquarium bed. It's not just a water bed. The production decided to top it by making it, Ken Adam makes it an actual aquatic aquarium bed they're laying on. It's just beautifully over the top, gaudy as and then the shot here where they're literally on top of the fish. It's just, but that's the scene where Tiffany, comes out and realizes that this is actually James Bond, again, showing she's an intelligent character up until a certain point in the film. So, yes, that's the name on the register, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. So it's also interesting that Felix still is a bit fussy. It's a different way of seeing Felix, but there is a rapport between Norman Burton and Connery on screen, which is always essential for Bond and Felix. The wonderful funny bit where Tiffany's like, "I'm cooperating. Really, I am." And if you look very closely, we see the reappearance of the iconic Connery blue holster. Of course, the actual holster part is black now instead of the tan color, but it's pretty iconic, I think, for Bond to have the shoulder part of the PPK holster to be the blue we first see in Dr. No. Again, Ken Adam outdoes himself here by trying to just make this as gaudy and ridiculously over the top as possible. Again, enough cannot be said about Ted Moore's photography. it really sells everything. Everything looks and feels assured. So you do still have that gloss of a Bond film, even though now we see Sean walking out to an early form of the panoramic elevator as a sightseeing elevator. But of course, in the long shots, it's I mean, this apparently still is Sean for a while, but in the longer shots, it's a stand-in. But it's amazing how much, because apparently Sean did not want to be on top of this thing, which Guy Hamilton totally understood. He said in the commentaries he totally didn't want to be on it himself either. But in the long shots where it's getting up really tall, that really high, that's not Sean. But yeah, this again is another example of something that was pretty novel in 1971 that audiences wouldn't necessarily have seen before, whereas now most people have seen or been on an elevator of this type. And of course, breaking into the villain's headquarters this way, it's not quite the same level of daring do on the surface. But when you think about it, here Bond is dangling on top of this enormously tall hotel in Las Vegas, and then in a really wonderfully done piece has this previously unseen gadget from Q, the gun that fires pitons, which apparently Tom Hanks loved to talk about how after the film came out, they got so many letters from climbers asking if this was a real thing. But Bond, as Blofeld later says, starts mountaineering about outside the White House. So this is a wonderful gag, which of course also sets up later, once Bond has been disarmed, that he still has one shot left, which is how he kills Blofeld's duplicate. But the thing is, it's also cool if you look very closely, there's such a little pop explosion when the gun goes off, Sean can't help but blink, which is something that, Roger Moore did with the prop guns all the time. Now this here, when Bond jumps off, this is still a moment that works. It's a moment that makes audiences go, whoa. And I've actually seen that physically happen. I've shown this film to people who have never seen it before, and I always have this wonderful delight when they still do that. Of course, this is Sean on stage at Pinewood, and that's a backdrop behind him. But if you look at even the twinkling of the lights of the background, it's so beautifully done. And of course, in the pre-digital age, all of this was done for real. And again, I think it's the fact that the lights are twinkling and there's some variance in it. It feels so real, and it obviously is off at a distance, and you see the whole lighted strip. So that's what sells this. Now Bond breaks in, and John Barry's score is very subdued, but it's got this nice twinkle to it, and here it gets this nice little bit of what's almost maybe militaristic or something. Bond is he's going to lower himself through, and you're like, okay, Bond is breaking to the enemy fortress, and then you're confronted with the fact that he's dropped into this overly elaborate bathroom. It's just weird enough. And of course, seeing all the phones and the controls and the observation devices, again, this is very much completely inspired by the stories surrounding Howard Hughes being completely cut off from the world, being the billionaire who was totally paranoid. And interestingly, Howard Hughes really made it able for the production to sort of take over Vegas. Basically word came down from up top where, Howard Hughes did have a penthouse like this in the actual White House that we see in the real Vegas, and basically helped smooth things over with the city of Vegas to get the production all of these permissions they wouldn't have otherwise gotten. I think without that, there was no way in hell they would have gotten the entire strip shut down for the car chase sequence there. Now, of course, we're introduced for the first time to the iconic Ken Adam penthouse set for Willard White, obviously taken over by Blofeld. That's the moment from Cubby Broccoli's dream where the chair turns around and it's an imposter, and they've made it Blofeld. Bond does have a nice bit of shock on his face. Of course, he's killed Blofeld in the pre-titles, and now he sees it's double jeopardy. And this, of course, means that Blofeld has already made doubles of himself, and we merely saw the next one being created. But what's also interesting about this is, I mentioned the film does actually pull quite a bit from the original novel, Diamonds Are Forever. And the pre-titles is a way of tying up loose ends and addressing On Her Majesty's Secret Service and getting that out of the way at the beginning so we can move on with a film patterned after Goldfinger. But Blofeld coming back and Bond being surprised and seeing that who he thought was there is actually Blofeld, in very many ways, is actually a very clever reworking of the Blofeld reveal in the You Only Live Twice novel. So in a way, that makes the third Blofeld appearance on screen in a film sort of the third book climax similarly, because Bond is confronted with Blofeld again and is able to exact a sort of revenge in the way that he is in the You Only Live Twice novel. I don't know if that was necessarily intended, but I think it's a really interesting thing to note. Now, I have to point out, I've always thought Bond's tailoring and his costuming in some parts of this film a little interesting. Of course, Sean does look a bit noticeably different. He is older, but I think it's primarily because his makeup and his hairstyling is quite a bit different than even what we saw him last in You Only Live Twice. But he still looks great. He still moves wonderfully. But here in this sequence, he has the very 70s wide lapels on the tuxedo, the very large bow tie, and of course the large carnation. And all of this has become iconic in all the times it's been used in stills when they pull images for the series, or they always use the shot of Connery killing Blofeld's double with the Peton gun, for clip compilations and things. So you see this version of Bond's tuxedo look quite a bit. And it's fun setting this up because Bond first looks at the missile, and like Dr. No, Blofeld's like, that's not a practical weapon. And Bond uses his one shot. Right idea, Mr. Bond, but wrong pushy. And of course, seeing the diamond necklace on the cat, on the right cat, is just, it's a wonderfully sublime touch. And then my favorite part of this sequence is, now that this has happened, we see the World's Greatest Marches tape. But my favorite part is Blofeld walking around and this sort of back and forth with the traditional Bond questioning, what are you going to do with those diamonds? And Blofeld is just toying with them. And then ends it by saying, if I were to tell anyone you, it would of course be you first, Mr. Bond. You know that. But it's now late and I'm tired and there's still yet so much left to do. It's just wonderfully bizarre. Blofeld has to get his beauty sleep and then sends Bond off to obviously be killed yet again. It's a wonderful sort of doing the traditional Bond villain back and forth, where Bond is at the villain's mercy, but it's so civil. And then Blofeld again references mountaineering about outside the White House as if, obviously they were just watching him, and Blofeld lets him come in, and now Bond has killed his double. So it's like, was this the plan? I have to say, I've always loved the silver-plated doors Ken Adam does here. Reminiscent sort of the copper-plated doors in Dr. No, and of course the silver doors in Atlantis and The Spy Who Loved Me. Of course, Bond jumps back, first looking at the floor, again, maybe anticipating The Spy Who Loved Me, is outdone by the gas from the ceiling. Also, funnily enough, the bottom level is labeled WW for Willard White. We're introduced back to Wint and Kidd via their shoes. If at first you don't succeed, try again. And here John Barry goes for full sly and macabre. He sells every sequence in this film. I do think it's one of his best scores. It's woefully underrated, as is the rest of the film. It is every part of this film is not given the credit it deserves for the beauty of its irreverence and its playing around with the Bond formula. Again, scenes like this, it has movement to it, and also apparently this is the tunnel. I believe they said this was actually the tunnel that runs underneath the Hoover Dam, and they were allowed to use it. And then, of course, the exterior here is just a setup out in the desert to show them emerging in the desert. But it's just moments like this, they're allowed to play out, and especially combined with the inherent dark humor and the slyness of the overall film, and topped off with John Barry's scoring, they're just beautiful to experience. It's still tongue in the cheek, of course, and then of course also important stuff is being relayed here, because that is the smashing of the aftershave bottle, which leads Bond, to smell himself as a tart's handkerchief, and sets up again the clue, the giveaway for Bond in the ending. That the Winton kid, because he's never seen them before. He's been attacked, he's been knocked out, and almost killed by them twice, but he has never physically seen them. So the suspense, the giveaway in the climax is, of course, set up here when Bond is doused with the odious aftershave. And, of course, I know some people have questioned why they just put Bond to be buried out in a pipe in the desert. Once you think about it, though, it is sort of a knowing nod to how various people were disposed of in the history of Las Vegas and organized crime. The whole notion of someone's body turning up in the desert, buried, and the only thing remaining is their hands sticking out with some playing cards, or just buried out in the desert. So I think it's obviously a nod towards that. And of course, Bond is buried in this pipeline, and essentially the hatches don't open from the inside, so he would be left there to rot. Of course, this references Dr. No right off the top of the head, because you see Sean Connery climbing around in a pipe. It's funny that he comes to and is sort of ruffled and bangs his head and looks around. And I love the dialogue here with the rat. It's just the right element of bizarre. And it's like, one of us smells like a Taj handkerchief. I'm afraid it's me. We get these nice close-up shots of the rat rubbing himself. Oh. And Bond says, sorry about that, old boy, which is sort of a reference to Thunderball climbing out of the Largo spool. In one of the audio mixes, Bond says, sorry, old boy. And we get the pipe scouring plug, which indirectly, I think, is sort of, it's obviously going to make people think of the pipeline sequence in The World Is Not Enough. Obviously, this is not moving at the same speed, but of course, you don't know what this is at first, and seeing this thing with all these sparks going off, it is sort of this malevolent thing coming towards Bond, and he very quickly is able to piece together how to stop it. And then we get this funny bit where the guys have to come out and fix it, and they're complaining about how it always breaks down away from the hatch. They open it, and then all of a sudden this guy dressed in an elegant tuxedo comes out. It's just a bizarre little flourish. Just out walking my rat and seemed to have lost my way. Nice hard cut to the White House with a nice John Barry sting. Gets us right back into Vegas. And now we're introduced to the wonderful Q gadget of the voice changer. And it's funny, Blofeld had to have this whole thing installed in his neck, which doesn't seem a very Blofeld thing to do. And Q is able to bang it together with some batteries and circuit boards and loose wires. So with all of Spectre's nefarious evildoers, good old Major Boothroyd can outdo him with a couple batteries and wires. And again, talking about the tailoring, I have to mention Bond's outfit here. The short pink tie is just, when you start to think about it, it's just like, oh no, it doesn't look good. I have always liked that nice reverse shot of Felix there, where we have the two CIA men, and it's a nice reverse shot. We get the visible ceiling with that nice tilted look to it. Again, I do think Ted Moore being back is really helpful. And again, the fact that we were still the film shot in the States on location and then went back to Pinewood, and you have Ken Adam coming back. So again, without those elements, it could have easily have gone over into the TV movie land that so many people accuse the film of being, which again I think is unwarranted and completely unfair. So now we're going to go to where Willard White has been sequestered, as it were. And it's interesting why Bond decides he has to go up there himself, but of course has to set up the fight with Bambi and Thumper. But it allows for this nice, ask me again in 10 minutes time. But, we're starting to wind back the spring to prepare the climax. Suspense is starting to build, but this whole setup allows for Bond's arrival here at this real location, which was, Kennan was going to design something, but then they found this wonderful house, which you can actually, it still exists. It was actually just sold recently. But Bond breaking in here and looking around with John Barry's rendering of the James Bond theme, Connery just slowly walking through, coat draped over his shoulder, music timed. He goes to, right when he goes to the glass door. It's one of my favorite introspective Bond moments. It's very simple. He's just walking into this strange house, but it's so beautifully put together that you're just on the edge of your seat for no reason. Of course, now we're introduced to Bambi and Thumper, which was a novel idea to, again, have a fight, but have it be different. And again, something sort of inspired by an idea that Guy Hamilton came up with, seeing some gymnasts doing things and imagining, you see an Olympic gymnast training and flipping around and everything, and just imagine, as Hamilton put it, imagine what they could do to you in a fight. You'd obviously, have to put up a good fight against something like that. It's very unconventional. So again, always trying to find something new and novel and fresh. And this has become an iconic scene, although it for a little while it does make Bond look, quite a bit, not very good. Basically, doesn't help that he's in the rather unfortunate little pink tie white shirt combo. It's that's always something that stuck out to me. I can't help it, but again, once you notice, it's like, oh no, please no. But anyway, this is yet another fun, inventive, wild little sequence. Never been anything like it before or since. So you can never make the criticism that Diamonds Are Forever isn't consistently inspired. And again, it's really key that the focus is on Bond. There is, eventually the plot is revealed to be a world on a world scale, but we keep the focus on Bond where it needs to be, because Bond is our narrative through line. That's the key of any Bond film. So it is refreshing to see that they could scale back. They could focus on the core elements again, even if they were completely moving towards trying to do what Goldfinger had done. And of course, now we get the nice cap in the swimming pool. John Barry's music comes in right there. Of course, here you can see it's clearly a double because the actors didn't want to jump in the water. And I love the fact that Bond is able to get the upper hand underwater, first by pretending to go under, and then the two hands come up. It's just, it's just the right. Again, it's finding that right element of humor. Not too much, but it's quite dark too. So again, I think it does help to understand that originally the film was going to be even more American-based. And before Sean came back, eventually they had settled on and actually signed John Gavin to play Bond. And in spite of trying to find a British actor, many Americans were thought of, and John Gavin would have been Bond until David Picker, really, who was then the head of United Artists by that point in time, and had always been a champion of Bond, and was a big fan, really insisted they had to try and get Sean back. And of course, he accepted the legendary deal he got at the time, which was, $1.2 million fee plus a percentage of the profits, and the ability to make 2 pictures of his own choosing for United Artists, which he did at least one under that deal. So he got creative freedom. And then, but to show that it wasn't really about money, he did donate his entire salary to the Scottish Educational Trust. But of course, obviously did get something from his profit participation, most likely. But I think there was also a notion of him coming back to sort of help out the series and stuff, so I'm sure there was maybe some of that. And he did have a lot of bad blood with both Broccoli and Saltzman, but I think in some ways they were sort of able to maybe bury some of that hostility a little bit. But also this became the firm, okay, now I'm really done. And that, of course, was slightly undone by Never Say Never Again when that eventually did happen 12 years later. But it's interesting to note this, and it would be, I'm sure it was not the easiest on-set experience for anybody because, of course, there would be that hostility between your lead actor and your producers. But anyway, it's an interesting thing to know, I think. So now we've been introduced to the real Willard White, brilliantly played by Jimmy Dean, who was trying to move into acting at this point, but I think was an absolutely inspired choice. And he is wonderfully humorous throughout. And here is Q's best scene where he's able to manipulate every single slot machine to make all of them pay out. It's a gorgeous little moment for Q, and something they're able to do with the help of the maintenance man for all the slot machines. And of course, as always, poor Q, no one ever pays attention to his explanations. Now, I have seen it discussed before, Tiffany seeing the woman ostensibly with the cat, and that being what drags her out, leading to the line, of course, look what the cat dragged in. People have wondered how Tiffany would know this, and of course, I think the only inference one can make is that Bond filled her in a little bit on Blofeld and the cat, or she heard about it from Felix talking to the other agents or something. And of course, it definitely helps that there's a black car with a guy dressed just like the other hoodlums earlier, and we get this wonderfully campy bit where Charles Gray is in drag. And it's yeah. In any other instance, it could be too much. But again, it's very brief, it's very sly, it's very witty, and like a lot of the great Mankiewicz flourishes, it stays under the radar of the narrative. So you can object to it, I think, but I think the film moves well enough and is witty enough that it wins you over to its side, or one would hope that it had by this point. Now, again, the way that Jimmy Dean plays all these scenes, the way he plays Willard White, he gets wonderfully frustrated. And it's also funny, everybody else isn't really familiar with him, they've never seen him before. And then Jimmy Dean just wonderfully just gets this, Tom, what did I tell you to do with this? I will admit to quoting many lines of this film and quite frequently doing most of the Willard White stuff. Of course, here is the incomparable Shane Rimmer once again appearing in a Bond film after appearing as Radio Man number 2 in You Only Live Twice, and would of course turn up again in The Spy Who Loved Me in a much bigger role. And of course, again, I'm pretty sure the actor there behind the control desk with the glasses is another one of the faces that turns up in You Only Live Twice as one of the technicians. And now we're getting the unfurling of the plot even further, because now we have the satellite in orbit. It's taking control of itself. This is actually a wonderful little bit of suspense and a wonderful... the sequence really works because we see all this happening, and of course everyone is unable to comprehend what's going on. Again, as said in the dialogue, it's as if it had a will of its own. And it's also got this nice bit of humor because it all is going wrong. The satellite is operating of its own accord, and no matter what, they can't control it anymore. But the suspense, the darkness of it is that, as said here, well, whatever it is, your friend Blofeld's controlling it now. And John Barry's score goes darker and then goes really big for the unfurling of the diamond plate. And here very quickly, they're able to realize that it is a weapon of untold power by realizing, all these diamonds on a satellite. Imagine what all of those could do to project a laser through it. And now we get the wonderful destruction of military sites across the world, which establishes the threat even further and substantiates it, because we see various military installations and personnel unable to comprehend with this type of weapon that no one's ever seen before. Although, if you look at some of the effects in these sequences, they're not very convincing. Particularly, this little cloud explosion is very goofy looking, and you'll actually see it appear again in the third explosion. Again, some because this was also shot in the U.S. because of guild regulations. They had to use a lot of American personnel. It was actually a battle to get Ted Moore allowed to be able to shoot the film, because originally it was supposed to have been an American cinematographer, which makes sense. So some of the special effects were done in the U.S., actually a good number of them. And unfortunately, there's some are effective. They're fine for the most part. There's one or two, particularly in this sequence. The explosion there, it almost looks stop motion-ish. Now we get to see the White Penthouse as it's supposed to be, although it's staffed with all the CIA fellows. And, of course, Willard White is going back to the job. It seems whenever anything important happens, he's in the bathroom. And I've always thought it was funny, okay, they found this tunnel and they all get on the elevator. Wouldn't it be funny if they hit the wrong button and get gassed and get knocked out, as Bond did? And all of a sudden the elevator doors open and all Felix Leiter and all the CIA agents are on the floor of the elevator car knocked out. I always love the acting of the fella on fire. Now here you see that same little plume of smoke as you did in the first explosion, which always stuck out to me. It's the exact same smoke plume. And of course, Ken Adams' design plays into the plot because, of course, there had to be a map somewhere, which is how Bond is able to pick out Baja California, which sets up the oil rig finale. And it had to not be obvious, so the dialogue plays around with it and sets up, Blofeld's plot is he's holding the world for ransom, which of course is typical. Obviously it's a version of the atomic bomb plot in Thunderball, holding the world for ransom. So this is how the film is playing around with the tropes of a Bond film. It's still a Bond film, always, but it's playing with audience expectations and allowing that to be the fun. And this is what Tom Mankiewicz really does, and that's the inherent satire of the film. That's what makes everything play and makes it different and fun. And of course, here Bond spots Baja California, and the reason why we know that's new is because, of course, White's vehement denials. I haven't got anything in Baja. Again, this is a real oil rig, which the production got to use and do a lot of explosions on. So it works really well, but of course, it is very much a lower key location and finale. But of course, it's still an oil rig. It's still a real working oil rig, and again, not something you were going to see a lot in 1971. But originally, the climax of the film was supposed to be a lot bigger. There was actually an underwater component. There were supposed to be divers diving out of the helicopters, and you actually see that on the film's poster. If you look very closely down at the bottom, underneath Connery and the girls on the poster at the very bottom, you see all these divers going in. I don't know how much of that was shot per se, or if any was really shot, but there was an underwater component. And of course, originally it continued on into Bond trailing Blofeld and the Batho sub into an abandoned salt mine, where they had a final mano-a-mano battle to the death. And eventually that was nixed, and of course, part of that obviously was you couldn't have a believable fight to the death between Sean Connery and Charles Gray. That would be stretching it a bit much for sure. But interestingly, Bond was going to follow Blofeld by holding onto a weather balloon attached to the submarine. And ironically, that is the same method used by Indiana Jones in the cut bit from Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he attaches himself to the submarine going to the secret base via his whip on the conning tower. Now, this is a completely novel approach. The usage of the balloon type device to walk across water. This again was something spotted by Guy Hamilton and others, and cooked up into this sequence of how Bond he doesn't infiltrate, he just approaches. And again, perfectly sold by the way that John Barry scores this. It's dramatic enough when we have the drop and the parachute opening, and then it's slightly playful and weird as this thing comes towards the screen, and then we go right into the James Bond theme. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm with the Acme Pollution Inspection. We're cleaning up the world. I thought this was a suitable starting point. I can't help but quote. I've used that quote too many times. But anyway, the James Bond theme is nice and very slow, but very laid back here. And it does really sell the drama of the scene. It gives it a danger element that it does need. You need that in every Bond climax. But it still has that slyness and that playful vibe. And, I mean, every part of this score is perfectly attuned to the way that Sean is in every single scene. So it cannot be stressed enough how important John Barry's score is to the soul of Diamonds Are Forever. I mean, every single note is what Sean is conveying in every single scene. And it's fun the way you see him, Bond is going through the motions here. He's having to break into a facility once again. He looks over, and there's Tiffany Case, and he's like, oh, there's a dragon lady. And I've always loved this bit. We're introduced to Bond's scheme, which Blofeld's figured out. We see the terror in the line of his suit. We have to listen to the marching tape for a moment. And in my most quoted line of the entire film, I do so hate martial music. It's Blofeld, it literally has more character in Diamonds Are Forever than either of the previous two films combined. We know what he likes, we know what he dislikes, and, he likes to go to bed early. He's slightly fussy, but he's just, again, very much like Quentin Kidd in the film. He is strangely endearing, and it's an interesting portrayal of the Bond villain. This is really one of the, you maybe associate with some of the Bond villains and you like them in certain ways, but this particular Blofeld, you kind of want to see him succeed just to see what he will do. And then the quote here, the humility is the worst form of conceit, that was something Tom Mankiewicz inserted. Cubby Broccoli wanted it removed. He thought it was too intellectual, and Guy Hamilton shot it anyway, and it was this sort of back and forth battle. And so Guy Hamilton shot it and didn't shoot any coverage, so it had to be in the film. And they had a fun back and forth with Cubby Broccoli over that one line. Here we do see that Tiffany Case, though seemingly having changed her stripes, as it were, is deciding to not go fully over to the villain's side. Here's another of the great Mankiewicz lines. The satellite is at present over Kansas. Well, if we destroy Kansas, the world may not hear about it for years. It probably didn't go over very well when this film was shown in Kansas, but it's just a wonderfully brilliant historical line. It's like the age-old question of why doesn't the villain just go ahead and, set off the weapon or do his dastardly deed? Why does he wait? And, of course, Blofeld looks, and if they did it then, they would just hit somewhere in Kansas. And now Bond knows exactly how he can substitute the tape and where it goes. And we get this wonderful, playful bit where Bond just presses the button, the tape pops on the ground. It's just, everybody freezes, but it's just a simple thing like that has derailed the whole plot of the film. And Bond simply substitutes the tape with the classic Bond sleight of hand. And we're starting to breathe a sigh of relief because Bond has achieved his mission. Now the plot cannot possibly succeed. But Tiffany coming in late sets up the fact that she does not realize that Bond has switched the tape. So here, again, an audience has seen a Bond film before, and we think, okay, we're going to get the countdown, and everything's going to blow up at the end, and everything's fine and over with. Bond just has to get off. But, of course, Blofeld says, search him again. I do love this moment here where Bond just turns around and Sean says, "Bitch." Of course, Tiffany plays, jumps so much with the tape being shoved in her rear that it would, definitely signal something to somebody. But Bond maybe should have realized that entrusting this to Tiffany, the fact that she wasn't in the room when he switched the tape, wouldn't have gone very well. So, of course, Bond sets off the signal, and we think all has been accomplished. But in one of the great examples of Guy Hamilton and Tom Mankiewicz pulling a trick on the audience to give that nice element of surprise to make the climax go, here we think Bond has escaped, but no, he actually gets knocked down again. Now there's 9 minutes to go, but we still think Bond has accomplished everything. He just has to get off the oil rig. Now Tiffany comes out and is so proud of herself. I switched the tape. Stupid twit, you put the real one back in. So now the suspense is back because Tiffany has undone Bond's work, which is absolutely hysterical when you look at it. But now Bond has less time. He's signaled for the helicopters to attack, that he's achieved his mission, and they can just blow the place up. And he has even less time to stop the satellite, and he's been locked down in the brig. So it's a nice bit of misdirection that is hysterically funny, but it's also very much like in Goldfinger, Bond being handcuffed to the atomic bomb and locked inside the vault at Fort Knox. It's multiple layers of having to get out of the scenario and stop the villain's plot. Of course, in Goldfinger, he also has to defeat Oddjob. So there are multiple levels, and that's reprised here in Diamonds Are Forever. But given a nice humorous setup, and it's funny that we now see Bond has completely failed, but not by his own volition because of the stupidity of the side character. And the fun bit of Metz here is that he's the pacifist who is, of course, has been misled by Blofeld and is now finally just starting to dawn on this poor dolt that he's been a dope the whole time. And once again, we get nice shots of one of the all-time great countdown personnel, the wonderful technician with the 7 minutes on counting. And it seems like he never moves, but he has the perfect inflection even when the explosions start going off. And again, what does make this sequence work is the fact that it's a real oil rig, and these helicopters start doing these really fast flybys. There are real explosions going off, which you have to be amazed at them being able to do this, set off big explosions on an oil rig. You would think that that would have been a big problem. But again, they go for it. The really convincing shots in particular are when the explosions go off on the rig, and we see all of the Spectre henchmen go flying, particularly the shot where they go over the railing. Unfortunately, some of the flyby shots, there are 1 or 2 effects that don't work very well, particularly the one where the helicopter, ostensibly explodes, and we get the explosion effect that covers the whole frame. That one is really dodgy. But again, the whole sequence works. It has a nice build to it. And again, things are starting to ramp up, but we still have time for humor, a bit more cheek than usual. So, despite what it may have seemed, Tiffany has retained her allegiance to Bond. But unfortunately, by this point in time, has become quite a bit of a bimbo, which is a shame. And Blofeld is still just barely perturbed, which I think really makes that work. Again, one wishes Tiffany would, grab a gun, do something, but it just doesn't happen. Again, more humor in the moment. Bond is locked in this brig, but they have never even checked to make sure there wasn't a very, not very easy, but, ostensibly a way out. Again, we do see a lot of shots of water. There's that shot there of the helicopter exploding, which, again, if you really look at this stuff, you can start to see, okay, yeah, there are some shots that really don't work. But interestingly here, Bond has to then clamber about underneath the oil rig, and very helpfully, there's some guide ropes for him to grab onto. There's the shot there where the explosion goes off and they go over the railing. That's the one they always use in trailers and clip montages. It's also really interesting that there are some random bullet hits down here when Bond is underneath the rig on the rope. So there's some ricochets once or twice that are cool. Again, there's another one of those helicopters exploding that just doesn't look very good. But again, the countdown is running. But interestingly, like I like to talk about, the difference with Hamilton viewing Bond more as an entertainment, there's no doubt that Bond is going to foil Blofeld's plot, even though the countdown is running down lower. So there's a time crunch, sure, but it doesn't have that same visceral quality to it. It's not, can Bond stop this? It's, how will Bond stop this? That's the key difference. If this was Terrence Young making this film, it would be, building up to a fever pitch right now. It's like, how can Bond possibly stop this? That's a key difference in the notion of Bond is serious thriller and Bond is entertainment. And of course, the best of both worlds, having elements of both, are how you get to Bond films. I think they achieved that on The Spy Who Loved Me, for example. And here we have the wonderfully designed Bathos sub for the film, which I've always loved the design of, although it is funny that Blofeld looks a little bit goofy. He has his headpiece on and everything. And of course, I've always wondered why all these Spectre henchmen never question when Blofeld just decides to hightail it out of there and leave them to their doom or what have you. But they fight on valiantly. Of course, one would think Blofeld being the head of Spectre, they would have a better way to send the sub off other than having it be lifted by a crane in the middle of this fight, this big battle, and then has to be lowered away and disengaged and stuff. But, then again, they are just on an oil rig, so it's not like they had a special escape hatch. Now, this film is completely playful, and never more so here, when everything unites to it being basically Bond having a bit of childish fun with the actual villain of the film when he uses the crane to pick up the sub with Blofeld in it, with Blofeld screaming in the headset, not realizing obviously that Bond has commandeered the crane and is having to figure out how it works and enjoying himself at Blofeld's expense, and then uses it to destroy the complex and stop the satellite and ostensibly kill Blofeld in this ignominious way. So, and again, John Barry picks up on this, and he brings back the iconic 007 theme, which had not really been used in quite some time, and he does it in this wonderful, jaunty way. It's slowed down, this wonderful shot where Blofeld's like, damn you, after the first hit. But again, Barry using the 007 theme, slowing it down. It's that reassurance, Bond is foiling the villain's plot, but we're all having fun. And it is still this great adventure, but it perfectly encapsulates what this sequence is doing. Now, this is where Tiffany goes into full bimbo mode. And it's rather unfortunate. The guys go down, but she closes her eyes and the machine gun recoil knocks her off the oil rig. It's just... It's a bit dumb. I just hate that she doesn't have more grit to her character. And then, of course, the countdown is cut off right here in the final 10 seconds by smashing in the Bathos sub once again. And now the explosions go off. This is the moment everybody knew was coming. But the fun of the climax is how that is delayed and built up to. And then 007 theme perfectly times here with this stand-in doing a beautiful swan dive off the oil rig. That's another one of those great trailer moments. It is in a lot of the trailers. Then we get this nice final panoramic shot around the oil rig with all these explosions going off. Again, amazing that they were able to do that on that real location. And then nice immediate cut to get us to the climax with the tag ending, which by this point had become a real speciality of Bond, and it was something Guy Hamilton really believed in, and that's why in his 4 Bond films, the tag ending with the final forgotten about villain, or villains in this case, become much more important. So, of course, we have the final scene with Winton Kidd, And this is already alluded to when you have the score already starting to go dark. This, of course, takes a scene from Fleming's novel on the cruise liner, and originally was recreating that, where Winton Kid captured Tiffany inside the cabin and tie her to the bed and have the pot of boiling oil above her. It's going to kill her, disfigure her when Bond comes in the door, and then Bond smashes through the porthole and gets the drop on them. Well, everybody involved realized, that just didn't quite work with the film they'd made, and it just didn't feel right. So they were able to come up with this sequence, which does sort of the same thing, has nice suspense to it, because, of course, we see Winton Kid one last time, and this wonderful bit where they've disguised themselves as ship waiters, and they wheel the cart in, and they just say, "Oh, it's compliments of Willard White." And, of course, the gag is they have the bomb hidden inside the bomb surprise. And this allows the byplay of Bond recognizing the smell of the aftershave, which we've gotten set up before. But the suspense is built because, of course, we think that they're going to maybe manage to kill Bond, because Bond has never seen them before. But Bond recognizing the smell, him toying with them, using his psychological attacks, which is Bond's key weapon, trying to get the villains to hoist themselves on their own petards to expose their charade, as it were. It's first alluded to with the line about the aftershave. Get the wonderful bit of misdirection, the stabbing. It first looks like he's going to attack Bond, but of course it's on the wine bottle. But he smells the cork and he makes the jab about the aftershave, looking for a reaction, gets enough of one to then set up his playing about the Mouton Rouge shield, and using of Bond's connoisseurship in wine, of course, which alludes back to From Russia with Love, and the opening of the film with the line about the sherry, but it sets up the fact that he's able to then give a verbal trap, which exposes Winton Kid. But once he does this, it's fun to see Winton Kid try and make that comeback. They think they've succeeded. Bond realizes, Bond reveals Mouton Rothschild is declared, referencing the rat from earlier. But then, interestingly, Bond just sits there for a minute and lets them come and attack. So I've always thought that was interesting. We get that nice little double take when we get the lighted shish kebabs. And originally, the shish kebabs and getting lit on fire was in the original scripted ending with the boiling oil. So that was something they kept. But then they redid it's also funny to see the reactions. Like, not only is his partner's been killed, so he starts strangling Bond even more viciously. And now we get the bomb reveal when Tiffany throws. It's like, why would she throw a cake? But it's obviously not a cake, and exposes the bomb. And then we get one final gag where we get the tails pulled up, and then the reaction, the beautiful John Barry cue that highlights the flip over and then the explosion. Connery's completely nonplussed. We get the final one-liner, which leads into the last knowing little winking line of the film. And then ostensibly this last glimpse up and seeing the satellite blinking away. And back into the theme song. So a nice little final flourish of danger, giving us that tag ending that became a hallmark of the Guy Hamilton films and a hallmark of the series, really. Firmly established by Goldfinger. There's the prominent Ford Motor Company cooperation credit. So once again, going to that. And, of course, all the various hotels and casinos of Las Vegas, without whom the film's production would have been most likely impossible. So, again, Diamonds Are Forever is an interesting film. It's really a one-off in the fact that it's got this inherent vibe of satire, and it was able to recapture significant audience shares and really strike very well with U.S. audiences, which was very important. And the key was getting Sean to come back to give that foundation, reassurance to people that Bond was still a serious thing. They were serious about Bond. Bond was still a big thing, and it was a significantly more successful film than On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Worldwide, the takings were I believe it was about $115 million was the final box office figures, roughly. And this is, of course, in 1971 dollars. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969 dollars had only done about 84 million. So it is something to note that it definitely was a successful venture. And actually, Diamonds Are Forever, if you're not looking at inflation, which would change things a little bit, actually was slightly more successful than You Only Live Twice was, actually. So that is a very notable thing. They were obviously onto something in reestablishing Bond as a larger-than-life figure, as a film event once again, which was something that you really didn't have in the marketing, release, and reception of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So I think that was important, very key of United Artists, but particularly David Picker among everybody, to realize that getting Sean back wasn't just getting the original guy back. It was, you had to show that Bond was important again, and that we tried this other thing, and it's getting back to the tried and true was a key thing, and that's what the whole marketing campaign was centered around. And even the first reviews, all said the same thing. It's fantastic. He's back. Everything is fantastic. Go have a fun time. And that's what audiences did in droves, and it was significantly more successful than On Her Majesty's Secret Service. What's interesting to note is, of course, they did try and convince Sean to stay around and do what became Live and Let Die. But they even sent Tom Mankiewicz over to talk with Sean, and Sean was just like, "No, I've done it again. That's it." But it's interesting to see look at that sort of marketing strategy and how they kept some of the ideas in Diamonds Are Forever, and that led into how Live and Let Die developed. Even though Live and Let Die, rather interestingly, when you look at it, it actually goes much more to the Terrence Young style. Live and Let Die really is Guy Hamilton doing more of a Terrence Young film. And in a lot of ways, Live and Let Die has a lot of similarities as a film to Bond as detective that we see in Dr. No. And it's a lot more realistic. It's even grittier than what you get in Diamonds, and you don't have that relaxed, sly vibe to it, even though both films are basically, 2-hour runtimes. So it's really interesting to see what they kept from Diamonds Are Forever and what they dropped and what they shifted around. And obviously then, tailored elements towards Roger Moore coming in for the first time, and then trying to avoid some of the traditional Bond elements so vividly associated with Sean Connery in the role. So it's also interesting to see how United Artists promoted the very next film and look at the performances and things, because ironically, for all the talk about Sean coming back, the film being very successful and being much more successful than On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the irony is, I think that built up a positive word of mouth and successfully relaunched Bond so much that despite the worry about Roger being a new Bond and maybe not being accepted by audiences, Live and Let Die was actually substantially more successful at the box office than Diamonds Are Forever was. It was less successful at the U.S. domestic box office, not by a lot, but it was slightly less. But worldwide, it was far more successful. So overall, it was actually significantly more successful than Diamonds Are Forever. So Diamonds Are Forever is really important because it is not a relaunching, but it's maybe you could see it as a declaration of intent, because looking at the series historically, this was a point where the Bond films could have gone anywhere. And like The Spy Who Loved Me 6 years later, the film release had to be something that declared Bond was here to stay. Bond was not a flash in the pan. Bond was not dead. Bond was not passé. And I think Diamonds Are Forever occupies a particular place in the series history that is really unenviable, because it was a very difficult pre-production process. It was very difficult to figure out the right way to make the film work, and to managing to get Sean to come back. Okay, you've done that, but then where do you go with that? And again, audiences were maybe a little bit jaded. They'd seen the previous Bond films, or at least some, so they knew what the score was. They knew what to expect. So how do you make that fresh? How do you make that exciting? And all the while acknowledge that, yes, all our fans are still here. Come on back. We have 2 hours of entertainment for you. We hope you enjoy it. We hope you find this entertaining and new and fresh in a different way. And I really do think they achieved that in this film. I think Diamonds Are Forever is a horrendously underrated film. I don't think people give it the credit that it deserves. And especially as an inherent, wickedly funny satire of the Bond formula. And the genius of this is, the film never throws away the Bond formula itself. It never stoops to the level of parody. There may be some inherent parody within it, but it's a satire, not a parody. And by not eliminating the villain narrative and the seriousness of some of the threats and the snake pits that Bond finds himself in and the danger of certain elements, that makes it, in the way that Connery once said, and I believe it was around this time period, he said in a press interview that, about coming back to Bond, but, he said that basically that James Bond is like a strip comic cartoon fantasy for adults. And I think that's a perfect way to look at the tone and the feel of Diamonds Are Forever. It is an escape from the ordinary, like any Bond film, but it has fun with it. And that's something that Tom Mankiewicz really brings in. That's something the producers and everybody was trying to do to give it an American flavor. But as I said, they needed an American who could write in the British idiom. And they found the perfect man in the young, aspiring writer, Tom Mankiewicz, who just did a brilliant job throughout his involvement with the Bond series, and would later bring so much to the original Superman film and many other things. But just an incredible writing mind, and I think that bridging his work with the original drafts by Richard Maybaum and that sort of back and forth again help keep the core Bond elements alive in Diamonds Are Forever, and having those core elements helps to sell everything else. It allows the comedy to be freer, and all of this with Guy Hamilton's, shorthand on the tiller allows Sean Connery on screen to brighten up and to be able to have new things to play as an actor. And while it's not serious straight drama, this had never been in a Bond film before. So there's a freeness to the film. There's a joy. There's a gaiety. And I think that is so important, and that's what makes the film play. That's what makes the film so special. And that's why I think Diamonds Are Forever is yet another masterpiece in the Bond series. Of course, I could defend any of the films, and I particularly feel I have to defend the films considered black sheeps of the franchise. But Diamonds, I think, stands on its own. It's a one-of-a-kind film experience. There's never been quite anything before or since quite like it. And, of course, being within the Bond series gives it its own identity to begin with. But it really does stand alone, and I think it needs to be looked at as the Bond film that manages to self-satirize itself and really become a fantastically witty, enjoyable, 2 hours out with an audience for the night. And I think it continues to entertain and amaze and just be a grand entertainment. So I think it should be looked at with all of this in mind, particularly the historical context of its release in 1971. So that's my commentary on Diamonds Are Forever. Again, with all of these are all just off the cuff stream of consciousness, and I hope it has been informative and entertaining. I finished one of these, and I feel I've just barely scratched the surface. So again, this is not meant to be a definitive film history. There are plenty of great materials on the DVDs and Blu-rays produced by the usual John Cork-led team. So definitely listen to the official commentary as well. But hopefully, if you've listened to my babbling through the film, hopefully you got something out of this. I feel Diamonds Are Forever is just one of those films I wish people would take more seriously. I feel it's so often very quickly written off as being weird or too campy or too goofy or too low-key or just not quite what a Bond film should be. But Bond does have to grow and evolve over time, and I think it was a very important thing to do, even though the obvious inspiration was Goldfinger, to follow Goldfinger as a formula, both in script and style, and trying to have a lighter touch and things. But it's as if the producers and United Artists and everyone always had Goldfinger as an idea in their mind, rather than really looking at what made Goldfinger work. And, had they done that, maybe they would have brought Paul Dane back, who really added a flourish of that lighter humor. But Diamonds Are Forever manages to stand on its own. I think that's because they brought in Tom Mankiewicz, who really brought an energy to the proceedings. Of course, he was a much younger man than everyone else and was a pretty fresh writer and an American to boot. But I think he brought this important sense of he was a Bond fan himself in the middle of Bond mania. He was in the lines with everybody else queuing up for Goldfinger and Thunderball and knew that Bond was a big event. And by being a fan of the films already and being a brilliant writer in his own right, I think he was able to use that sense as a fan to try and slightly turn things on their head a little bit, try and tilt things slightly. So, yes, it's a typical Bond film. Yes, it's things you've seen before, but it's got a slight inherent comedy. Everything's tilted ever so much to where, when you look at it very closely, it is frequently absolutely hysterical, particularly for Bond fans, because we read a lot more into these. We've seen these films thousands of times, but it's helpful sometimes to have, the writer is in on the joke, as it were. And Mankiewicz established a rapport with Guy Hamilton that I think came to its fullest fruition on the next film, which he wrote solo, which is Live and Let Die, which will be the next commentary I tackle. So anyway, thank you so very much for listening, and hope you enjoyed watching the film with me. And if you haven't been a fan of Diamonds Are Forever, I really hope that this commentary, if you stumble across it, maybe encourages you to take a fresh look at the film and maybe find something there that you hadn't quite considered before. That's really my goal of this commentary track, and of all the films that are considered the black sheep of the series. I feel Bond is not taken seriously enough in general in the public's eye, especially the critical side of things. Never do you see Bond described as art, which it is. So I really hope that this is at least it's a way for me to try and hopefully encourage people to look at the film much more seriously and hopefully appreciate what I think it successfully achieves. So thank you so very much for listening, and as always, very humbly yours, I'm the motion picture analyst. I shall return with my next commentary in Live and Let Die.